Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Mr. Hunter Lewis about crony capitalism in the United States. Mr. Lewis is co-founder of AgainstCronyCapitalism.org. He has contributed to the New York Times, the Times of London, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic Monthly. He is the author of 9 books, including Crony Capitalism in America, 2008 to 2012, and Are the Rich Necessary? You can follow his work at AgainstCronyCapitalism.org. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/crony-capitalism. Hunter, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Well, thank you for joining us. So let's get started with the simple definition of what crony capitalism is, and then why is it such a big problem? What's wrong with it?
Well, in terms of what it is, it's when special interests of all kinds ally themselves with the government and use the power of the government to work their will and get what they want. So it may be the government is using the special interests, it may be the special interests are using the government, but when they get together, they're extraordinarily powerful, as you could imagine. And it's an extremely toxic combination because, after all, the government is supposed to protect us. Isn't that what the government's for? It's supposed to protect us from invasion, from force, from fraud, from illegal behavior, and so on. So when government allies itself with special interests, we're all vulnerable to what happens. And in my view, it's really crony capitalism, this kind of government crony alliance, which has kept the human race poor over the millennia. I don't think anybody on earth needs to be poor. I don't think anybody on earth would be poor if it weren't for crony capitalism. It's the one thing that holds the human race back.
Now, we're going to go into a bit more detail and kind of go by group in a minute. But first, I'd like to ask, how pervasive really is this problem in the world compared to the United States? How is it more pervasive here? Is it more pervasive elsewhere in the world? Or is it just as bad everywhere?
Well, crony capitalism is the basic system throughout history. As you go back in history, it's always been some species of crony capitalism. You know, sometimes it's been called communism, as in Russia in the 20th century. Sometimes it's been called capitalism, but it's always been some species of crony capitalism. And as you go around the world today, I can't think of a single country that doesn't exhibit some elements of it. But certainly some countries are better than others. Russia, China, and increasingly the United States are particularly bad.
So who's to blame most for this system? And is it the politicians? Is it special interest groups? Who should most of the blame be placed on?
Well, at least in the United States, since we do have a democratic system and we do have a vote, I guess we have to blame ourselves, that we tolerate it. And of course, we tolerate it because we don't really understand what's going on. I mean, the average voter doesn't quite get what's being done to him or her by this combination of special interests in government. And there's a great deal of confusion. But ultimately, I can't blame politicians or special interests more. I mean, they're equally guilty, but we're guilty too because we let it go on.
Let's go through the role and break it down for some folks, since you said a lot of people don't know exactly what's going on. So explain to us kind of the role of the politicians, the special interests, the lobbying groups, and the other groups that are involved in these situations.
Well, I mean, people do have an idea that politicians in Washington or in state capitals are being influenced more by special interests than they are by the voters. So, I mean, I think there is some dim recognition of that and maybe an increasing recognition of it. The lobbyists are very involved because they represent the special interests. They also control a lot of the campaign contributions. After all, what a politician wants above all is to remain in office. And so in a system like ours, that means they need to be reelected, and that means they need votes, and that means they need money to campaign with, and they get money in whatever way they can get it, and that means aligning themselves with special interests. So the whole system kind of impels them to make deals with special interests. Now, when I say special interests, I use that phrase because a lot of people think the problem is an alliance between business and government. It is, that's true, but it's also an alliance between unions and government, between lawyers and government, between universities and government, It's not just business. It's
There's,
all, it's all
there,
these
seems,
kinds of special interests.
there seems to be a person who you keep repeating, right? Government. They always seem to be the same one, paired up with the other two. So
Well, government is an essential element of all this. I mean, you see, consider, for example, for a moment that you're a business. You are regulated in a market system. You're regulated by the market. It's a very onerous system. You've got to be extremely efficient. You've got to keep your prices down. You've got to keep your quality up. If you don't, you'll go bankrupt. So if you don't play by the rules, you get thrown out of the game. And businesses don't like that. They want to escape the discipline of the market. They want to escape the regulation of the market. And again, the market is a much more powerful regulator than government. So they simply go to government and they try to get the rules of the market lifted by the government. And we see this all the time. I mean, take the drug industry. They take a natural substance, they twist the molecules, they patent it. All right, so once they patent it, they already have a monopoly, a government-granted monopoly. Then they take it, they get FDA approval. There's been billions of dollars to get FDA approval. That's a second monopoly position. Now nobody can compete with them. They can set whatever prices they want. They don't have to worry about competition. It's wonderful. They love it. So government is an essential ingredient in crony capitalism. You need the power of the government. You want the power of the government on your side.
All right, now let's go through some examples of how crony capitalism has played out and continues to play out. So let's start with the stimulus package and the bank bailouts, both hotly controversial issues. Maybe a rare instance where crony capitalism actually became a controversial political issue. But what role did crony capitalism play in the stimulus package and in the bank bailouts?
Well, it was about 99% crony capitalism. Certainly, we have to step back for a moment and ask why we had the crash of 2008 in the first place. The primary reason was that the government was printing way too much money, and that money was creating great effects for certain business clients and special interest clients, but not doing anything for the average person whose income was not rising. Anyway, the bubble that was created by the government burst, and when it burst, they simply bailed out their client banks. It's unfortunately true that we don't really have a private market in the banking system at all. It's completely government controlled. The banks are just really appendages of the government at this point. And I think the primary reason the government bailed out Wall Street to the degree it did was not worry about what was going to happen in the economy. It was worried that they could not sell their own debt, that the government itself was going to run into a huge problem of nobody buying their debt. And all their debt is sold through Wall Street. So they bailed out Wall Street basically for that reason.
So no surprise, the Federal Reserve, another institution that engages in crony capitalism, also played a role in this whole mess and in promoting crony capitalism even further.
Well, the Federal Reserve and other central banks, because they're all in it together, and certainly the dot-com bubble was blown up by primarily the Federal Reserve, but lots of other central banks were involved. And then the housing bubble, the same, and now we're sort of doing the same thing all over again. We're blowing up another international bubble with all of the central banks involved.
let's go through some more of these examples. We just talked about the banks. Now let's talk about the automotive industry, another industry that was favored in bailouts. Let's talk about how they were affected and how their large lobbyists play such a big role. We see it mostly with the big corporations, right? The automotive industry, the agriculture industry, the pharmaceutical industry, as we were talking about before. So what are the things that really make all of these different large companies and industries the same? What do they all have in common that's making them so powerful and able to make all these rules and get all these benefits?
The auto industry is less powerful by far than the drug industry. It has much less money, and it's all about money. So therefore, you have to ask, why is it? It's quite clear why the government would bail out the drug companies or bail out Wall Street. They depend completely on Wall Street to sell their bonds. They depend on Wall Street for financial contributions. Why would they bail out the auto industry? Well, one of the main reasons is because the auto industry just happens to have many or most of their employees located in key swing states like Pennsylvania, Ohio. Those are the states that decide every presidential election. So you want those voters to stay happy, and therefore you want those companies to stay happy. But even then, oddly enough, I mean, the way the government handled it, I mean, look at the way they handled General Motors. The Obama administration intentionally allowed all of the debt holders of General Motors to lose every penny. That is, the mom and pop debt holders, the average people. And by the time of bankruptcy, it was mostly mom and pop bondholders. The sophisticated money, was not holding a lot of General Motors bonds at that point. They knew what was going on. But these average people who had thought, well, the one safe thing I can invest my retirement funds in would be General Motors, they were still holding it. So they lost every penny. The government didn't care. They let them go. And at the same time, the unionized employees, the United Auto Workers, they made out like bandits. They absolutely, got most of the company. They didn't lose anything in the bankruptcy the way the bondholders did. But by the way, the warranty holders also, the people who had bought General Motors vehicles, they had warranties. All the warranties were voided. The government thought that was just fine. So they bailed out the company, but they let the warranty holders go hang, along with the small bondholders. And they enriched the union. And of course, the union is a major, major contributor to the Democratic Party. Now, I don't mean to beat up on the Democratic Party because, of course, both Republican and Democratic parties play this game, but they have different clients to some degree.
Yeah, and one area where the Democratic Party, well, maybe not the party, but a handful of politicians in there and some of the base has made a point of mentioning crony capitalism and criticizing it is with Goldman Sachs. So if we can return to the banking industry for a moment, what role has Goldman Sachs played in crony capitalism, and why is it generally identified as one of the key participants in this system?
Well, Goldman Sachs is extraordinarily active in lobbying, in financial contributions to politicians. They play the system like a fiddle. They've also got their people in key government positions. The revolving door that people talk about, where people go from Wall Street to government, back to Wall Street and other industries, a lot of that, Goldman Sachs is very involved in that. So that they really exploit their government contacts in a very clever way. Goldman Sachs would have gone bankrupt in the crash of 2008. They should have been allowed to go bankrupt, but they were bailed out by the government. And they were not only bailed out in the way that people mostly understand, through the bailout, that is, through the actual funds that they received, but they were given a special provision where they were suddenly reinterpreted to be a bank. And as a bank, they could go to the Federal Reserve and borrow at virtually zero interest rates. They'd never been a bank before, but now they're suddenly a bank. Now they can borrow from the Fed. So a lot of the bailout of Goldman Sachs was not even the bailout you read about. It was this bailout that nobody understood or knew about, where they were borrowing billions of dollars at no interest from the Federal Reserve, and then they were speculating with that money and making profits on it. And by the way, they continue to do that to this day. They're still a bank, so-called, and they still are able to borrow at the Fed, and they're still able to speculate with that money. So wouldn't that be nice if everybody else could borrow at 0%?
And one thing we always see, especially right with Goldman Sachs, and we've seen, I think, both Democratic presidential candidates say this, is, well, we need to break the banks up, right? Instead of Goldman being able to both borrow from the Federal Reserve and make speculative plays, why don't we break those two apart? And the other solution, quote unquote, that we see is folks saying, well, we just need more regulators, right? We need more government in order to hold all these people accountable. So what's the problem with both of those solutions?
Well, let's take the more regulation idea. In the first place, it's always seemed to me illogical if you have a problem where government and special interests are in cahoots with each other. How does it solve anything to make government more powerful? Doesn't that just make it worse? It's like you've got a hangover and you think more alcohol is going to solve the problem. So it isn't logical. Second of all, the historical record is poor. At the time of the crash in 2008, every one of those Wall Street firms that would have gone bankrupt and the one that did go bankrupt, they had federal regulators embedded right in their offices, in their staff, supposedly watching everything they did, and a lot of good that did, didn't it? And the regulators, they simply don't have enough understanding. They don't really know what's going on, and if they do know what's going on, they've probably been bought off.
So let's look at another company that's had a particularly close relationship to the government, and that's General Electric. Now, their relationship seems to have really increased during the Obama administration. There seems to be a really cozy relationship between them and the Obama administration. But what role does General Electric play in the crony capitalist system?
Well, they're certainly a major player, and it did precede the Obama administration. At the time of the 2008 crash, General Electric had more earnings from their finance division than from their other divisions. And they were involved in very speculative activities with their finance division. So they would have gone bankrupt also had the government not bailed them out. So the government said, the Secretary of the Treasury said, I got the call from General Electric. I knew that when I got the call from General Electric, that meant that the crash had gone from Wall Street into Main Street. Nonsense. The crash hadn't gone into Main Street at all. The crash was still in Wall Street, and it was still in bad practices in Wall Street, and it was just in the GE financial division. So they were bailed out by the Bush administration. But having happened, I think GE sort of doubled up on their coziness with government in order to be sure that it didn't happen again.
And let's just continue down this list of companies we got here. And what about Monsanto? Large agricultural company, and agriculture subsidies always play a huge role. Every year they seem to be just passed over and over again, kind of rubber stamp passed. There's not really much of a conversation around it. What is their relationship with the government like, and how has that evolved?
Well, it's so deep. It's hard to know where to begin. I mean, in the latest budget authorization bill, there's a little hidden provision for X number of millions of dollars to educate the public on how wonderful biotech is. And again, that's just to help Monsanto. So the U.S. government, the taxpayers' money is supposed to be used to propagandize in favor of Monsanto. Some of the papers that were leaked earlier showed how all the embassies all around the world are working for Monsanto, propagandizing for Monsanto. Again, they've got people all through the government. The person who's in charge of food safety in the FDA right now is a former Monsanto employee. They've got people everywhere, and they have financial contributions everywhere. And it's also kind of interesting to note that the reason they got into their present business, the biotech side of the business, is that Mitt Romney actually, as a consultant, put them into that. He recommended they go into it. And so he was the reason they went into it. And they've been just, buddy-buddy with every administration and every Congress since.
Well, it really is remarkable to look at the revolving door between Monsanto and the Department of Agriculture and the FDA and some of these other parts of government. But let's look at the healthcare industry a little bit. So there's obviously a ton of crony capitalism in the healthcare industry. We see this with Big Pharma. We see this with the FDA. We see this with vaccines. What are some of the biggest aspects of crony capitalism in healthcare?
It's just crony capitalism top to bottom, and that's why it costs so much, and that's why it's so inefficient. We could have a very good, efficient healthcare system if we could get rid of the crony capitalist influence. Again, it all started in the 1960s when government put in Medicare and Medicaid and some of those things, all well-intentioned, all meant to help people, but instead it gave government a stranglehold over medicine, and increasingly that meant that special interests could use government to get their stranglehold. So the pricing, just to give you an example, just recently, the FDA really regards all the drug companies as its clients, so it is trying to destroy compounding pharmacies because they make drugs that are not controlled by drug companies. And if they can get rid of the compounding pharmacies, then the drug companies can charge whatever they want on their drugs. Now, we all know about, you go to a doctor and sometimes you get a B12 shot. So the FDA said the doctor can no longer keep the B12 in the office, increasingly cannot get it from a compounding pharmacy. He has to get it from the drug company. So what happened? The price of the B12 shot has now gone up 6 or 7 times just in the last half year, say. And that's just what's happening all through medicine. No wonder the prices are so high, because all these monopolies are created and protected by the government.
Well, in one of the chapters in your book, Crony Capitalism in America, which of course we'll link to at wakeupcallpodcast.com/crony-capitalism, but one of the chapters is called Vaccines, a Crony Capitalist's Dream. That seems like a particularly juicy chapter title. How are vaccines a crony capitalist's dream?
You see, first of all, the drug industry has been doing rather poorly in recent years. They don't have new, quote, blockbuster drugs to replace the older ones. The profits are slipping. So they really have seen vaccines as their hope for the future in terms of profitability. And vaccines are always done in alliance with the government. The government has really become not more than a crony in the vaccine industry. I'll give you an example. The Gardasil vaccine for young women and now for young men, which is supposed to prevent genital warts and supposed to prevent cancer, genital cancer. So that was originally developed by the government, and the woman who developed it in the government then licensed it to Merck, and Merck was then was given it really, and then she fast-tracked it through the FDA. She ensured that the placebo used to test it was a placebo that would ensure that Gardasil would pass the FDA test. Now, they didn't use an objective placebo on the test. She got it approved. Gardasil then went out into the world. The rate of adverse events with Gardasil has just been unbelievable. There was just a study from Canada a few weeks ago saying that 10% of the girls that take it end up in the emergency room. And what happened to the woman who developed it in conjunction with Merck? She left and became the head of Merck's vaccine division.
Can you explain a bit more? You were just talking about the placebo and how they were not using the placebo correctly. Could you explain that a bit more? I'm not sure I understood.
Yes. A placebo, when you test something like a drug, you have the drug and you have the placebo. The placebo is supposed to be completely innocent, like the sugar pill. And therefore, and some people get the placebo and some people get the drug. Mm-hmm. And that's a better test than just giving people the drug. If 10% of both groups have some adverse event, you know that it's not from the drug because half of them got the placebo, right? But you can game that by creating a placebo that isn't really a placebo, that will cause adverse events. And that way, the drug will not look worse than the placebo. That's exactly what she did. As far as, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, so I can't really go too far in this, but the adverse events on the Gardasil vaccine are really frightening. And there's some, and of course, Merck tried to go to every state and get them to order it, so you had to take it. And they tried to get legislatures to pass it. That was a big controversy in Texas because, as you remember from the last campaign, the governor of Texas was behind that, trying to get it mandatory in Texas, and he was also taking a lot of money from Merck.
Right, yeah. Daniel and I live in Texas, and that was a big controversy here. Rick Perry's involvement with that and the way he kind of forced that through on young girls.
And Rick Perry is a classic crony capitalist. I mean, he really was smooth in terms of all the crony capitalism he did in Texas.
Right, no, and it extends far beyond just Merck and vaccines. He was, I suppose he still is, but of course he's out of office.
Right.
A very, very major player in the crony capitalist system in Texas. But I want to return to a topic that you briefly mentioned earlier, but we didn't really flesh out a whole lot, and that's public sector unions. How are public sector unions a form of crony capitalism?
Public sector unions are really just a vehicle through which taxpayer money can be funneled into political campaigns. If you go back, Franklin Roosevelt said, we can't have public sector unions because what are they going to do? Strike against the voters? I mean, we can't allow that. So he was totally against it. John Kennedy wrote an executive order which brought these public sector unions into being in the 1960s. And he did it because he was pretty sure that they would be able to raise money for the Democratic Party. So in effect, what happens is the voters provide the tax funds, which then go to the public employees. They then have to be members of these unions. They have no choice about the fact that they have to pay dues to the union. The union then takes a certain amount and gives it to the Democratic Party. So this has been going on ever since John Kennedy, and that's about all it is. They're not allowed to strike. They're really just in business to raise money for the Democratic Party. I remember one particularly amusing moment when the governor of New Jersey, forget his name, gave an impassioned speech in which he was speaking to a union group, and he said, I will fight with every ounce of my strength for a fair contract for you. Well, the union was actually negotiating with him, so he didn't really have to fight very hard.
And another area where we see some crony capitalism is with the lawyers and law firms involved. Can you explain how that relationship works?
Yeah, absolutely. So what the lawyers want from government are rules that it will enable them to launch a lot of successful and lucrative lawsuits. And the federal government is more or less favorable to what they're doing, depending on their campaign contributions. The individual states are more or less receptive to what they're doing. Mississippi is, for example, a state that is well known for being receptive to trial lawyers who launch class action suits. And if you know the judge, you're in pretty good shape, and so on. You make contributions to the judge, you make contributions to the legislators. You get you create a system which favors trial lawyering and the plaintiff bar, and you get rich because they can make millions and millions of dollars of these class action lawsuits.
So earlier you made a rather bold statement about the poor and the way they're affected by crony capitalism. So obviously we would have to say the poor are one of the main losers from this. But who else loses out from the crony capitalist system, and how and why do they lose?
Well, I think we all lose from it. Even the rich lose from it, ultimately. It's like a tax on the whole system that, all this money is being siphoned off, or the market system is not functioning well because of all these monopolies that are being created. But the biggest losers are the poor, but just almost as big are the middle class. I mean, the middle class are just absolutely maligned by this process. They're told, get an education, work hard, you can rise in the world, and yet what seems to really make people wealthy these days is government connections of one kind or another. It could be that you get a government contract, like through the stimulus program. It could be that you're Goldman Sachs and you get money from the Federal Reserve, which you use to speculate or get rich with or whatever you want. But just the average person who's trying to work hard, save, create a family, whatever they're doing, they don't have much of a chance in this system. It's a form of corruption, and it's always corruption that throughout history has held us all back, has made us poor.
Well, and it also really hurts the young, and it affects charitable giving. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it certainly does affect the young. I mean, I think the young, and right now there's almost a war against young people. It's unbelievable. They are saddled by all of this student debt. And let's think about, how the student debt program worked out. Again, well-intentioned. Let's provide funds for kids to go to college. So the kids borrow, the kids sign the debt instrument, the money goes to the school. The school then just increases its tuition and fees. So, the kids aren't any better off. They just have to borrow more and more in order to pay higher and higher fees to the schools, which are adding more and more administrators and more fancy buildings and so on. So now, as you know, you've got more than $1 trillion of this debt. It's like a form of indentured servitude. The kid comes out of school and has got all this debt on his or her back. It's really it's not fair. It's not right. I mean, to do that to kids. And then almost everything else we do seems to strike at them. Obamacare, for example, the system, immediately, as soon as Obamacare came in, they put in a system where being young didn't get you a cheaper policy. I mean, it does, but in the old days, it got you a much cheaper policy. Now there's a limit to how much credit you get for being young. So that in effect, the young are subsidizing the old. Then the Obama administration says, let's require overtime, and they're about to redo the overtime rules all over again, and that really hurts the young people, because if businesses have to pay overtime to the young worker who's just starting, they won't hire them. Obamacare had that effect also, because it raised the cost of the initial employee, so that the young person who, let's say, was getting minimum wage, well, it might seem to be only $7, but by the time you factor in the Obamacare cost, it was going to be $10 or $11, so you don't get hired. The minimum wage itself works against young people. I don't understand why, they can't say that at least teenagers have a different minimum wage, but that doesn't suit the politicians.
So what is the solution to the current crony capitalist system, and how difficult do you think it's going to be to solve this thing, as it's so entrenched in our system and has been for so many years?
Yeah, it's entrenched historically, it's entrenched globally, and so how can you get rid of it? It's actually simpler than it seems. All of these interventions that the cronies want involve some modification of the market system, which is basically a price system. So if you look at the proper role of government, you just say, if government is doing things that affect prices, it's probably going to have some kind of crony capitalist consequence. If you can look through all the government laws, all the government regulations, and I think we need laws. So if it's not affecting prices, it's probably okay. If it is affecting prices, it's probably illegitimate. It's pretty simple, actually. It might seem complicated, but it's simpler than it seems. So it would be possible to reform the system in a way that would eliminate 90% at least of this stuff.
So what do you think the chance is that we'll see those sorts of reforms come about?
It's always a small chance, but what I do wish is that Rand Paul had not run this time for president, because then Ron Paul, I think, would have run, and there would have been a debate in effect between Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders, which would have been very, very useful, because Ron Paul has some of these insights, and I think to have him, in effect, he wouldn't have been on the same stage, but in effect, debating with Bernie Sanders would have been very educational for young people. And it's young people that we have to explain this to, and try to make it less confusing so they can figure out what they need to do when they vote. So what are the odds of fixing it? Small, but would it be difficult to fix? No.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And what are some recommended readings that you have for our listeners, and where can our listeners go to follow more of your work?
Of course, I would recommend cronycapitalism.org. And actually, the Mises Institute would be a good place to go to for basic economics. Some of that can seem complicated, but if you want to learn about economics, that's a very good place to go to. They certainly understand the need to restore the price system, which we have lost.
We will link to both of those on the show notes page for sure.
Yeah, we definitely will. And just to remind everybody, the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/crony-capitalism. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/crony-capitalism is the place to go. And we'll link to againstcronycapitalism.org. We'll link to your book, Crony Capitalism in America. We'll link to the Mises Institute. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/crony-capitalism. And I also want to encourage everybody to follow us on Twitter. That's at WUC Podcast. And on that note, Hunter, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you
for helping us tackle this important topic, and hopefully we can talk to you again sometime soon.
I look forward to it.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.